Jae-won Choi sat in his Manhattan office at 2:47 a.m., unable to sleep, watching security footage from his penthouse on 3 different screens. He did this every night since the accident, watched his daughter sleep, watched the empty hallways, watched for dangers that his money and power couldn't prevent. But tonight, he watched something that would change everything he thought he knew about trust, class, and the girl he'd hired 3 weeks ago to care for the most precious thing in his world. Before we begin the story, comment below with the city you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Jae-won Choi was 34 years old and controlled a business empire that most people couldn't comprehend. As CEO of Choi Industries, one of South Korea's top 5 conglomerates with holdings in technology, real estate, and manufacturing, his decisions affected thousands of employees across 3 continents. His penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Midtown Manhattan, where he'd relocated the North American headquarters 2 years ago. From the outside, Jae-won had everything. The Seoul business press called him a genius. Forbes had featured him in their 30 Under 30 list years ago, then again in 40 Under 40. His custom suits were made in Milan. His watch cost more than most people's cars. When he walked into a restaurant, staff recognized him immediately, even in New York, where Korean business royalty meant less than it did in Seoul. But anyone who looked closely would see something else. The shadows under his eyes, the way his jaw stayed perpetually clenched, the fact that he never smiled anymore. Not since the accident. Not since the night 8 months ago when his wife, Soo-jin, had been driving home from a charity event in the rain. Not since the truck had run a red light. Not since Jae-won had gotten the call that shattered his world into before and after. Soo-jin had been 6 months pregnant. They'd lost them both. Well, almost both. Their daughter Min-seo had been in the car too. She'd survived with a broken arm and trauma that manifested in nightmares, separation anxiety, and a fear of cars so intense that getting her to preschool required sedatives prescribed by a child psychologist. Min-seo was 4 years old, and she was the only reason Jae-won was still standing. But being a single father while running a global corporation from a city where he had no family support was destroying him. The nannies he'd hired through elite agencies kept quitting. His hours were impossible. Min-seo's night terrors were exhausting, and Jae-won's grief made him cold and impossible to work for. He'd gone through 6 nannies in 6 months. Then 3 weeks ago, the agency had sent Sophie Martinez. Sophie was 26 years old, the daughter of immigrants from El Salvador, and she'd grown up in Queens taking care of her younger siblings while her parents worked multiple jobs. She had no fancy credentials, no recommendations from wealthy families, no experience with children of Jae-won's caliber, as the agency director had delicately put it. "Mr. Choi, I'm being honest with you," the director had said over the phone. "The candidates you've requested, Ivy League educated, multilingual, experienced with high net worth families, they're not interested in the position. The hours are too demanding and, frankly, your reputation as an employer has become problematic." Jae-won had felt rage flash through him, hot and immediate. "Then why are you calling?" "Because I have someone who might work. She's not what you asked for, but she's been with us for 4 years, and every family she's worked with has tried to keep her permanently. She's extraordinary with children, especially children dealing with trauma. But what? But she's not from the background you specified. She's working class, attending community college at night to finish her degree. She won't fit the aesthetic of your household." Jae-won had almost hung up. Aesthetic. As if what mattered was whether the person caring for his traumatized daughter looked good in his penthouse. But he was desperate. Min-seo had been having nightmares every night for a week, and Jae-won hadn't slept more than 3 hours in just as long. He had a board meeting in Seoul in 2 weeks that he couldn't miss. "Send her," he'd said. Sophie had arrived for the interview in a modest dress, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, carrying a worn backpack instead of an expensive purse. She'd looked around the penthouse, at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, the museum-quality Korean art on the walls, the grand piano no one played anymore, with wide eyes. "This is... wow," she'd said softly. Most candidates had tried to look unimpressed, as if they encountered this level of wealth regularly. Sophie's honest amazement had been oddly refreshing. "Can you handle the hours?" Jae-won had asked bluntly, not bothering with pleasantries. "I leave at 6 a.m., often don't return until 8 or 9 p.m., sometimes later. Sometimes I'm in Seoul for a week at a time. Min-seo has significant trauma from losing her mother and unborn sibling. She has nightmares. She's in therapy. This isn't a normal childcare position." Sophie had met his eyes directly, something else most candidates hadn't done. "Mr. Choi, I've been taking care of people since I was 8 years old. My mom worked 2 jobs, my dad worked construction. I raised my 3 younger brothers. One of them has autism, another had severe anxiety after our apartment got broken into when he was 6. I know what traumatized kids need." "This is different. Because she's rich?" Sophie had asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Trauma doesn't care about tax brackets, Mr. Choi. She lost her mom. She's scared. She needs someone who'll be patient, who'll show up every day, who won't leave. That's what I do, I show up." Something in her directness had cut through Jae-won's defenses. "When can you start?" he'd asked. That had been 3 weeks ago. In those 3 weeks, Jae-won had watched Sophie transform his daughter's world. She'd replaced Min-seo's rigid routine with gentle flexibility. She'd turned breakfast into art projects, using fruit to make faces on pancakes. She'd read to Min-seo for hours in different funny voices. When Min-seo had a nightmare, Sophie didn't just comfort her. She'd started a dream journal, where they'd draw the scary dreams, then draw new endings where Min-seo was safe and strong. Most remarkably, Sophie had gotten Min-seo into a car. It had happened gradually. First, Sophie had played pretend car with pillows in the living room. Then they'd watched videos of cars, talking about all the safety features. Then they'd gone down to the building's parking garage just to look at Jae-won's car. Finally, last week, Min-seo had sat in the back seat for 5 minutes, holding Sophie's hand, while Sophie sang songs from Frozen. Jae-won had watched this all on the security cameras he'd installed throughout the penthouse. He'd initially told himself it was for security, but really, it was because he didn't trust anyone with his daughter. He'd watched Sophie's patience, her creativity, her genuine affection for Min-seo. He'd also watched her eat ramen for lunch every day because she was clearly trying to save money. Watched her study textbooks late at night after Min-seo was asleep, sitting at the kitchen counter doing homework for the community college classes she took online. Watched her carefully hand-wash a blouse in the bathroom sink because she only seemed to own 3 work-appropriate shirts. Sophie was nothing like the polished professional nannies he'd hired before. She was better. And tonight, at 2:47 a.m., Jae-won was about to watch her become a hero. On the security monitor, Jae-won saw Sophie's bedroom door open. She emerged in an old college t-shirt and sleep shorts, her hair messy, rubbing her eyes as she walked toward Min-seo's room. Jae-won leaned forward. Min-seo was having another nightmare. He could see his daughter thrashing in bed on the other monitor. He reached for his phone to call Sophie, but she was already there, somehow having heard Min-seo before the monitor's audio even picked up the cries. Sophie knelt beside Min-seo's princess bed, gently touching the little girl's shoulder. "Min-seo, sweetheart. You're safe," Sophie murmured. "I'm here. You're okay." Min-seo's eyes snapped open, wild with terror. Mommy crashed. The lights are too bright. Mommy." "I know, honey, I know." Sophie climbed into the bed, gathering Min-seo into her arms. "But you're not in the car. You're home. You're safe. Can you feel my arms around you? Can you hear my heartbeat?" Min-seo pressed her face against Sophie's chest, her small body shaking with sobs. This had become routine over the past 3 weeks. Sophie would comfort Min-seo, stay until she fell back asleep, then return to her own room. Jae-won had watched this scenario play out a dozen times, but tonight was different. On the monitor, Jae-won saw Sophie suddenly go rigid. She lifted her head, sniffing the air. Then her eyes went wide with alarm. "Min-seo, we need to go right now," Sophie said, her voice urgent but controlled. She scooped the little girl into her arms. "What's wrong?" Min-seo asked, clinging to Sophie's neck. "Nothing, baby, but we're going to play a game. We're going to go really fast, okay?" That's when Jae-won smelled it too, even in his office 15 blocks away, or rather, when his brain registered what Sophie had already detected on the video feed. Smoke. His fingers flew to his phone, pulling up the building's fire alarm system. No alerts, nothing. On the monitor, he watched Sophie run toward Min-seo's bedroom door, then stop abruptly. She touched the door handle and jerked her hand back. The door was hot. Jae-won's heart stopped. The penthouse was on the 45th floor. If there was fire between Sophie and the main exit. He watched Sophie spin around, assessing the room with the kind of quick thinking he'd only seen in boardrooms during crisis management. She ran to Min-seo's window, looked out, then ran back to the bathroom. "Min-seo, remember how we practiced being brave?" Sophie's voice was steady despite the smoke that was now visible on the camera, seeping under the bedroom door. "I need you to be so brave right now." Jae-won was already running. He'd grabbed his phone, his keys, his mind calculating. 15 blocks this time of night. He could be there in 4 minutes if he broke every traffic law. On the monitor, Sophie had soaked towels in the bathroom sink and stuffed them under the door. She'd pulled Min-seo into the bathroom, turned on the shower to create steam, and was now smashing Min-seo's piggy bank to get coins. Coins. What? Then Jae-won understood. The bathroom window. It was one of the few that opened, designed for emergency ventilation. Sophie was using the coins to unscrew the window lock that hadn't been opened in years. His phone was already pressed to his ear, screaming at 911, at building security, at anyone who would listen that there was a fire on the 45th floor, that his daughter was trapped. On the monitor, Sophie had gotten the window open. Cold night air rushed in, clearing some of the smoke. She'd climbed out onto the narrow decorative ledge, still holding Min-seo against her chest. Jae-won's blood turned to ice. She was going to try to reach the fire escape. It was 12 feet away, around a corner of the building, designed for the adjacent apartment. "Don't," Jae-won whispered to the screen even though she couldn't hear him. "Sophie, don't. Wait for firefighters." "Don't." But Sophie was already moving. Her bare feet finding purchase on the ledge that was barely 6 inches wide, 45 stories above the Manhattan street, holding a 4-year-old against her chest while smoke poured from the window behind them. Jae-won stopped breathing entirely. He watched Sophie press her body against the building, inching along the ledge with Min-seo's face buried in her neck. One slip, one gust of wind, one moment of panic, and they'd both. He couldn't think it. Couldn't let his mind go there. His car screeched to a stop outside his building 3 minutes later. Fire trucks were arriving, sirens wailing, but Jae-won was already running into the lobby, screaming at security to show him the camera feeds. The security guard pulled up the exterior cameras and Jae-won saw them. Sophie and Min-seo, still on that impossibly narrow ledge, now just a few feet from the fire escape. Sophie's hand reached out, grasping the fire escape railing. She pulled herself and Min-seo onto the metal platform, and only then, only after they were safe, did she collapse, shaking uncontrollably, her arms still locked around Min-seo like a vice. "I've got you," Sophie was saying, her voice cracking. "You're safe. You're okay. I've got you, I've got you, I've got you." Jae-won watched firefighters reach them, watched them being brought down, watched Sophie refuse to let go of Min-seo until they were on solid ground. Then he was running again, bursting through the crowd of evacuated residents and emergency personnel, searching for "Daddy!" Min-seo's voice cut through everything. She was wrapped in a foil blanket, but she broke free from the paramedic and ran toward him. Jae-won dropped to his knees on the cold pavement, catching his daughter as she crashed into his arms. He buried his face in her hair, his whole body shaking with sobs he couldn't control. "You're okay," he kept saying. "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." "Sophie saved me," Min-seo said, pulling back to look at her father with wide, serious eyes. We went on the scary ledge, but Sophie said I was brave, so I was brave. And Sophie was really brave. Jae-won looked up and saw her. Sophie sat on the back of an ambulance, an EMT wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Her feet were bleeding. Jae-won could see cuts from the ledge. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the bottle of water someone had given her. She was staring at nothing, her face gray with shock. She'd almost died saving his daughter. This girl who made barely above minimum wage, who ate ramen for lunch to save money, who studied late at night for classes at a community college. She'd risked everything for a child who wasn't even hers. Jae-won stood, still holding Min-seo, and walked over to Sophie. She looked up when his shadow fell over her, and for a moment they just stared at each other. "Mr. Choi, I'm so sorry. I should have checked the smoke detectors. I should have..." Sophie's voice cracked. "I didn't know what else to do. The door was hot and I couldn't get to the main exit and I just..." "You saved her," Jae-won interrupted, his voice rough. "Sophie, you saved my daughter's life." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I couldn't let anything happen to her. She's been through so much already. I couldn't..." Her voice broke completely and she started crying, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body, the shock and terror she'd been holding back finally breaking through. Without thinking, Jae-won sat down next to her on the ambulance bumper, Min-seo still in his arms. He didn't know what to say. There were no words for this. Around them, fire crews were confirming the fire had been contained. An electrical malfunction in the unit next door, not even in Jae-won's penthouse. The smoke that had seeped through the ventilation system hadn't even been dangerous levels yet. But Sophie hadn't known that. She'd smelled smoke and acted immediately. The fire chief approached them. "Sir, we need to talk about your security system. The fire alarms in your unit didn't trigger because they weren't properly connected to the building's main system. That's a serious violation." "Fix it," Jae-won said flatly. "Bill me whatever it costs. I don't care." The fire chief nodded and walked away. Sophie was still shaking, still crying. The EMT kept trying to check her feet, but she kept pulling away. "Sophie," Jae-won said quietly, "you need to let them look at your injuries." "They're just cuts," Sophie whispered. "I'm fine." "Is Min-seo okay? Did they check her? She didn't breathe too much smoke, did she? She's perfect because of you." Jae-won's throat was so tight he could barely speak. "Sophie, you could have died." Sophie finally looked at him, and Jae-won saw something in her eyes that broke his heart. She genuinely didn't understand why he was so shocked that she'd risked her life. "She's a child, Mr. Choi," Sophie said simply. "Of course I would." As if it was obvious. As if there was no other possible choice. Jae-won thought about the 6 nannies before her, the ones with impressive resumes and elite credentials. He wondered, with sudden sick certainty, if any of them would have done what Sophie had just done. "We should get you both to the hospital," the EMT said. "The little girl seems fine, but we should do a full check. And you," he gestured to Sophie's feet, "need those cuts cleaned and bandaged properly." Sophie nodded numbly. Jae-won found himself saying, "I'll take them, my car." "Sir, the ambulance is better." "My car," Jae-won repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. 20 minutes later, they were in Jae-won's Mercedes, being driven to Mount Sinai by his driver. Min-seo had fallen asleep in her car seat, the first time she'd been in a car without having a panic attack since the accident. Sophie sat in the front passenger seat, still wrapped in the foil blanket, staring out the window at the pre-dawn streets of Manhattan. "You should take a few days off," Jae-won said from the back seat. "Rest. Recover. I'll arrange..." "No." Sophie's voice was quiet but firm. "Min-seo needs routine, especially after this. If I disappear, she'll think I abandoned her." Jae-won felt something twist in his chest. She was right. Min-seo had lost her mother. Another disappearance, even temporary, could be devastating. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," Sophie continued. "Same time. She needs to know she's safe, that I'm not going anywhere." "Sophie..." I'm not leaving her, Mr. Choi. Sophie finally turned to look at him, and Jae-won saw steel beneath the exhaustion. Not after what she's been through, not after tonight. I said I'd show up, and I mean it. In that moment, Jae-won realized something he'd been too blind to see before. Sophie Martinez wasn't just a babysitter. She wasn't just an employee. She'd become something else entirely. She'd become the person Min-seo needed most in the world, and Jae-won had almost lost them both. The next morning, Sophie showed up at exactly 6 a.m., just as she'd promised. Her feet were bandaged, she was limping slightly, but she was there. Min-seo's face lit up the moment she saw her. "Sophie, you came back." "Of course I came back, Munchkin." Sophie knelt down, wincing slightly, and hugged Min-seo tight. "I told you I'd be here." Jae-won watched from the kitchen, pretending to drink coffee he couldn't taste. Over the next few days, something shifted in the penthouse. Jae-won found himself coming home earlier, joining Sophie and Min-seo for dinner more often. He'd watch them together, Sophie helping Min-seo with a puzzle, reading stories, playing elaborate pretend games where Min-seo was a superhero saving the city. He'd also started watching Sophie more carefully. Not on the cameras, he'd actually turned those off in the common areas, keeping them only on the entrances for security. But in person, he watched. He noticed that she never bought lunch, always bringing something cheap from home. He noticed her winter coat was too thin for New York winters. He noticed that she studied during every spare moment, her textbooks worn from multiple readings. One evening, after Min-seo had gone to bed, Jae-won found Sophie at the kitchen counter, staring at her laptop with a look of quiet devastation. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Sophie quickly closed the laptop. "Yes, Mr. Choi. Sorry, I'll get out of your way." "You're not in my way." Jae-won sat down across from her. "What's wrong?" Sophie hesitated, then sighed. "It's nothing, just I was going to graduate next semester, finally finish my bachelor's degree. But my financial aid didn't come through for the spring, and I can't afford the tuition out of pocket, so I'll have to postpone another year, maybe longer." "How much do you need?" Sophie laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "More than I have. It's fine. I'm used to things taking longer than planned." "How much, Sophie?" She named a figure that made Jae-won's jaw tighten. It was less than he spent on a suit, less than his monthly car payment, a completely insignificant amount of money to him, and an insurmountable barrier to her. "I'll pay it," he said. Sophie's eyes went wide. "What? No, Mr. Choi, I can't. You saved my daughter's life." Jae-won's voice was firm. "You risked your own life without hesitation. You show up every single day and give Min-seo the care and attention she desperately needs. The least I can do is make sure you can finish your degree." "That's not... I didn't do it for..." Sophie struggled to find words. "I don't want you to think I'm trying to take advantage." "Sophie," Jae-won leaned forward. "Do you know how much I pay the lawyers who review my contracts? The consultants who advise me? The people who do a fraction of what you do for Min-seo? If this is about fair compensation, you're drastically underpaid. Consider it a bonus." Sophie stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll register for spring classes." "Mr. Choi, Thank you. Thank you so much. I promise I'll work extra hard. You already work too hard," Jae-won interrupted. "And stop calling me Mr. Choi all the time. When it's just us, Jae-won is fine." Sophie blinked. "That feels weird. You're my boss." "I'm Min-seo's father, and you're..." Jae-won paused, realizing he didn't have a word for what Sophie was. "Your family. To her. To us." The words hung in the air between them. Sophie's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked away. "I should get some sleep," she said quietly. "Big day tomorrow. Min-seo wants to try sitting in the car again." After she left, Jae-won sat alone in the kitchen, thinking about that word. Family. His real family was in Seoul, his father, who called monthly to demand when Jae-won would return to Korea permanently. His two brothers, who were jockeying for position in Choi Industries, waiting for their chance to prove they could run the company better than Jae-won. None of them had come to New York after the accident. None of them had met Min-seo more than twice. His father had sent a brief condolence message about Soo-jin and the unborn baby, then immediately started discussing business succession plans. Family, in the Choi world, was about duty and legacy. It was cold, transactional, built on expectations rather than affection. But when Min-seo laughed at Sophie's silly voices during bedtime stories, when Sophie stayed up with her through nightmares without complaint, when they held hands during scary moments, that felt more like family than anything Jae-won had experienced growing up. Over the following weeks, Jae-won found himself restructuring his schedule to be home more. He started leaving work at 6 p.m. instead of 9 p.m. He began joining Sophie and Min-seo for breakfast before work. He told himself it was because Min-seo needed him more, especially after the fire scare. But if he was being honest, and Jae-won prided himself on honesty in business, even if he was less practiced at it in personal matters, it was also because he enjoyed being there. He enjoyed watching Sophie's creativity with Min-seo. He enjoyed their conversations during quiet moments. He enjoyed having someone in his home who treated him like a person, not a CEO or a chaebol heir. One Saturday morning, Jae-won had no meeting scheduled, a rarity. He woke up to the sound of laughter from the living room. He walked out to find Sophie and Min-seo having a dance party, pop music playing on the speaker while they spun around in their pajamas. Min-seo squealed with delight as Sophie dipped her dramatically. Neither of them noticed Jae-won watching from the doorway. He felt something crack in his chest, some wall he'd built after Soo-jin died, some barrier between himself and the possibility of joy. For the first time in 8 months, he felt something other than grief and exhaustion. "Daddy!" Min-seo spotted him and ran over. "Sophie's teaching me ballet." "That's not ballet, Munchkin," Sophie laughed, slightly breathless. "That's just me making up moves." "It's beautiful," Min-seo insisted. Jae-won found himself smiling. "It is." His eyes met Sophie's and something passed between them. Something warm and unspoken that made Sophie look away quickly, tucking her hair behind her ear in a gesture he'd come to recognize as nervous. "I should make breakfast," Sophie said, heading toward the kitchen. "What do you want, Min-seo? Pancake art?" "Yes, make Daddy a pancake that looks like him." As Sophie and Min-seo disappeared into the kitchen, debating how to make pancakes look like Jae-won, he stood in the living room feeling completely off balance. He was attracted to Sophie. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just gratitude or respect. It was attraction. The way his pulse quickened when she smiled. The way he found excuses to be in whatever room she was in. The way he'd started noticing how the morning light caught her hair. This was a disaster. Sophie was his employee. She was 26 to his 34. She was from a completely different world. Queens, community college, working-class family. His father would have a coronary if Jae-won even suggested he was interested in someone who wasn't from an elite Korean family. Not that it mattered. Soo-jin had only been gone 8 months. Jae-won was still grieving, still waking up reaching for someone who wasn't there, still flinching when he saw pregnant women on the street. He couldn't possibly have feelings for Sophie. Could he? The next few weeks were torture. Jae-won tried to maintain distance, but it was impossible when Sophie was in his home every day, being perfect with his daughter, being kind and funny and brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with Ivy League degrees or elite credentials. He learned that Sophie wanted to be a child psychologist, that she'd grown up translating documents for her parents who'd never fully mastered English, that her youngest brother had just gotten into Hunter College, and she'd cried with joy because he'd be the first in their family to attend a 4-year university from the start. He learned that she loved old movies, that she'd taught herself to cook by watching YouTube videos, that she had panic attacks sometimes but pushed through them because people are counting on me. He learned that she was stronger than anyone he'd ever met, and not because she didn't feel fear or pain or doubt, but because she felt all of those things and chose to show up anyway. and he learned that she was falling for him too. It was in small moments, the way she'd look at him when she thought he wasn't watching, the way her voice softened when they talked late at night after Min-seo was asleep, the way she'd started wearing her hair down more often. One evening, after a particularly hard day where Min-seo had regressed and refused to go near any windows, Sophie had broken down crying in the kitchen. "I don't know what to do," she'd admitted, wiping at her tears angrily. "I thought we were making progress, but she's so scared again. What if I'm not helping? What if I'm making things worse?" Jae-won had done something then that he'd been carefully avoiding. He'd touched her. Just his hand on her shoulder, meant to comfort, but the contact had sent electricity through his entire body. "You're not making anything worse," he'd said quietly. "You're the best thing that's happened to her. To us." Sophie had looked up at him, and in that moment, Jae-won had been absolutely certain they were about to kiss. Then Min-seo had called from her room, breaking the spell, and Sophie had pulled away quickly, going to check on her. That had been 2 nights ago, and Jae-won hadn't stopped thinking about it. He was on a video call with his father in Seoul when the issue came to a head. "Your brothers are telling me you're spending too much time in New York," Chairman Choi said bluntly, his lined face stern on the screen. "The board needs you present. When are you returning?" "I have a daughter here, Father. I can't just—" "Bring her to Seoul. Hire proper staff here. This American experiment has gone on long enough. Min-seo has a therapist here. A routine. She's finally starting to heal. Children are resilient. She'll adjust." Chairman Choi's tone left no room for argument. "I expect you back by the end of the quarter. The merger with Kim Industries requires your direct involvement." After the call ended, Jae-won sat in his home office feeling the walls close in. He'd known this was coming. His father had been patient, by his standards, with Jae-won's grief. But patience in the Choi family was measured in months, not years. The business came first. Always. There was a soft knock on his door. "Come in," Jae-won called. Sophie poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt. Min-seo wanted me to ask if you'd read her bedtime story tonight. She picked out a new book about a princess who saves her own kingdom." Jae-won managed a smile. "Tell her I'll be there in 10 minutes. Sophie lingered in the doorway. "Are you okay? You look tired," Jae-won supplied. "Sad," Sophie corrected gently. Jae-won sighed. "My father wants me to move back to Seoul." Sophie's face went carefully neutral. "Oh, I see." "I'm not going," Jae-won said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "But isn't that where your company is? Your family?" "My daughter is here. Her life is here. Her therapist, her routine, her—" He stopped before saying, "you." But they both knew that's what he meant. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself. "Mr. Choi, Jae-won," he corrected. "Jae-won," she said, and he loved the way his name sounded in her voice. "If you need to go, Min-seo will be okay. It'll be hard, but kids are more resilient than we think. And you can't put your whole life on hold." "I'm not putting my life on hold." Jae-won stood up, walking around his desk. "For the first time in 8 months, I feel like I'm actually living again. Min-seo is healing. I'm learning to be present instead of just going through motions. And that's because of you." Sophie's breath caught. "I'm just the babysitter." "You're not." Jae-won took a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "You're not just anything, Sophie. You're—" His phone buzzed. Min-seo's monitor. She was crying. The moment shattered. "I'll go," Sophie said quickly, turning toward the door. "Sophie, wait." But she was already gone. Jae-won leaned against his desk, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. This was getting out of control. He needed to make a decision. About Seoul, about his father's demands, about his feelings for Sophie that were becoming impossible to ignore. But how could he choose? Every option meant losing something essential. Later that night, after Min-seo had finally fallen asleep, in her own bed this time, a small victory, Jae-won found Sophie in the kitchen making tea. "We need to talk," he said. Sophie turned, her expression guarded. "If this is about Seoul, you don't have to explain, I understand. I'm in love with you." The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. Sophie froze, the tea bag suspended above her mug. "I know I shouldn't be," Jae-won continued now that he'd started, unable to stop. "I know it's inappropriate. You work for me. You're younger than me. My wife has only been gone 8 months. My father would lose his mind. Every logical reason says this is wrong." "Then why?" "Because logic doesn't account for the way you love my daughter. The way you showed up when everyone else quit. The way you risked your life without thinking twice. The way you make me laugh when I thought I'd never laugh again. The way you're brilliant and kind and strong in ways that have nothing to do with money or status, or any of the things I was taught to value." Sophie set down her mug with shaking hands. "Jae-won, I'm not asking you to feel the same way," Jae-won said quickly. "I know this complicates everything. I know I might be your boss, might have power over your job, and that makes this, I love you too." This time it was Jae-won who froze. Sophie looked at him, her eyes bright with tears. "I've been trying not to. Trying to be professional. Trying to remember I'm just the help. Trying not to notice how good you are with Min-seo when you let your guard down. How hard you're working to heal. How much you care even though you pretend you don't. But I can't help it. I love you." They stared at each other across the kitchen. "This is a terrible idea," Sophie whispered. "The worst," Jae-won agreed. "Your father will hate me." "Absolutely. It could ruin everything. Probably. We should be sensible." "We should." Neither of them moved. Then Jae-won crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her. Sophie's arms came up around his neck and she kissed him back with a desperation that matched his own. She tasted like chamomile tea and possibility. Her hair was soft under his fingers. She fit against him like she'd been designed to be there. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jae-won rested his forehead against hers. "What do we do now?" Sophie asked. "I don't know," Jae-won admitted. "But I know I'm not losing you. I'm not losing this. I'll figure out Seoul, my father, all of it. But I'm not walking away from you." "You promise?" "I promise." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, and Jae-won felt something he hadn't felt since before the accident. Hope. The next morning, Jae-won called his father. "I'm not moving back to Seoul," he said without preamble. Chairman Choi's face darkened on the video screen. "Jae-won, we've discussed this. Min-seo needs to stay here. Her therapist is here. Her routine is here. She's healing, and I won't disrupt that. Then leave her with staff while you handle your responsibilities." "No." Jae-won's voice was steel. "I'm her father. I'm not going to abandon her while she's still recovering from losing her mother. You're being emotional. Your brothers can handle the New York operations. I'm CEO, father, not them, and I can run the company from here. We have technology for that. What we don't have is a replacement for the stability Min-seo needs right now." There was a long silence. "There's something else," Chairman Choi said slowly. "Something you're not telling me." Jae-won thought about Sophie, about Min-seo's laughter, about the life he was building that had nothing to do with his father's expectations. "I'm rebuilding my life here," Jae-won said carefully. "Min-seo has people she depends on. People who've been there when we needed them. I'm not uprooting her from that." "People," Chairman Choi's eyes narrowed. "What people? This is about that babysitter, isn't it? Your assistant mentioned she's become quite involved with the family. Sophie saved Min-seo's life during the fire, so pay her a bonus, show your gratitude. But don't let gratitude cloud your judgment about what's appropriate, Jae-won. You're a Choi. You have responsibilities to this family, to the company, to our legacy. Some working-class girl who watches children. Stop." Jae-won's voice was cold. "Don't speak about her that way." Chairman Choi leaned back, a knowing expression on his face. "I see. You've developed feelings for the help. Jae-won, this is beneath you. Soo-jin has barely been gone. This conversation is over, Jae-won interrupted. I'm staying in New York. If the board has issues with that, they can vote me out. But I'm not abandoning my daughter. Not for the company, not for legacy, not for anything. He ended the call before his father could respond. His hands were shaking. He'd never stood up to his father like that. Never chosen personal life over business. The Choi family didn't do that. Duty always came first. But Jae-won was done sacrificing the people he loved for duty. There was a soft knock on the office door. Sophie poked her head in, looking concerned. I heard raised voices. Are you okay? Jae-won looked at her, at this woman who'd saved his daughter, who'd brought joy back into their lives, who'd made him remember how to feel something other than grief. I'm perfect, he said, and meant it. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new normal. Jae-won and Sophie kept their relationship private for Min-seo's sake, not wanting to confuse her while she was still healing. But in quiet moments, after Min-seo was asleep, during early morning coffee before she woke, they were together. Jae-won learned about Sophie's family, met her brothers via video call, listened to her talk about her plans to work with traumatized children once she finished her degree. Sophie learned about Jae-won's complicated relationship with his father, his guilt over Soo-jin's death, his fear that he'd never be good enough for Min-seo. You're exactly what she needs, Sophie told him one evening as they sat on the couch, her head on his shoulder. Not perfect, not some idealized father figure, just you, showing up, trying your best, loving her through everything. I learned that from watching you, Jae-won admitted. 3 months after the fire, Min-seo finally agreed to go in the car for a real drive. With Sophie in the back seat holding her hand and Jae-won driving carefully through Manhattan traffic, they made it all the way to Central Park. Min-seo's therapist called it a major breakthrough. Jae-won called it a miracle. 6 months after that, Jae-won sat Min-seo down for an important conversation. Sweetheart, you know how Sophie lives here now, how she's with us every day? Min-seo nodded seriously. What would you think if Sophie became part of our family officially? If she married me and became your stepmother? Min-seo's eyes went wide. Then she launched herself at Jae-won, squeezing him tight. Yes, 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 yes. Can we have a princess wedding? Can I be a flower girl? Will Sophie really stay forever? Jae-won laughed, hugging his daughter close. Yes to all of it. That evening, with Min-seo helping, mostly by offering suggestions like put it on her finger and tell her you love her, Jae-won proposed to Sophie in the living room where she'd first danced with Min-seo, where she'd brought light and laughter back into their lives. The ring was simple. Jae-won had learned that Sophie didn't want flashy displays of wealth, just something real, something meaningful. Sophie Martinez, he said, kneeling in front of her while Min-seo bounced with excitement beside him. You saved my daughter's life. You saved mine too, in a different way. You showed up when everyone else left. You loved us when we were broken. Will you marry me? Sophie was crying and laughing at the same time. Yes, yes, absolutely yes. Min-seo cheered. We're going to be a real family. We already were, Sophie said, pulling Min-seo into the hug as Jae-won slipped the ring on her finger. We've been a family for a long time. The wedding was small and perfect. Sophie's family, a few close friends, Min-seo as the flower girl who took her job extremely seriously. Chairman Choi didn't attend, but he sent a stiff message of congratulations that Jae-won chose to interpret as grudging acceptance. During the vows, with Min-seo standing between them holding both their hands, Jae-won promised to value Sophie's strength, and Sophie promised to always show up. I promise to see you, Jae-won said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just the help, not just the person who takes care of Min-seo. I promise to see Sophie. Your dreams, your needs, your incredible worth that has nothing to do with me or what you can do for my family. I see you and I love every part of what I see. Sophie smiled through her tears. I promise to keep showing up. Even when it's hard, even when the nightmares come back, even when life gets complicated. I promise to be here, for you and for Min-seo, building this family we've chosen together. When they kissed, Min-seo clapped and announced to everyone, "That means they love each other forever now." At the reception, Sophie's father, a quiet man who'd worked construction for 30 years, pulled Jae-won aside. "You take care of my daughter," he said in heavily accented English. "She's been taking care of everyone else her whole life. Your turn now." "I will," Jae-won promised. Every single day. A year later, Jae-won and Sophie stood in front of a new building in Queens, a community center offering free child care and child psychology services, funded by a foundation Jae-won had created in Soo-jin's name. Sophie, who'd graduated with her bachelor's degree and was now in a master's program for child psychology, would run the clinical side. They'd hired a dozen therapists, all from diverse backgrounds, all committed to serving families who couldn't afford traditional mental health care. Soo-jin would have loved this, Jae-won said quietly, holding Sophie's hand as they looked at the center that would serve hundreds of children. "She would have," Sophie agreed. "You're honoring her memory by helping others." Min-seo, now 7 and thriving, tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, when can I come volunteer here?" Sophie said, "When I'm older, I can help with the little kids." Jae-won lifted his daughter into his arms. "When you're ready, sweetheart, no rush." "I'm going to be a child psychologist like Sophie," Min-seo announced confidently. "I'm going to help kids who are sad like I was sad." "You will," Sophie said, ruffling Min-seo's hair. "You'll be amazing at it." As they walked back to the car that Min-seo now rode in without fear, Jae-won reflected on everything that had changed since that night he'd watched Sophie save his daughter on the security cameras. He'd thought he was hiring help, someone to watch Min-seo while he worked. Instead, he'd found family, found love, found someone who'd seen past his wealth and status to the grieving father underneath. Someone who'd chosen them every single day, not because they paid her, but because she cared. "What are you thinking about?" Sophie asked, noticing his expression. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Jae-won said honestly. "How close I came to missing this because I was looking for someone with the right credentials instead of the right heart. The agency director tried to warn you I wasn't what you asked for," Sophie reminded him with a smile. "She was wrong," Jae-won said, pulling Sophie close and pressing a kiss to her temple. "You were exactly what we needed. You just weren't what I knew to ask for." That night, after Min-seo was asleep in her room, decorated with pictures she'd drawn of their family, including one labeled, "The Night Sophie Saved Me," Jae-won and Sophie sat on their balcony overlooking Manhattan. "Do you ever think about that night?" Sophie asked. "The fire?" "Every day," Jae-won admitted. "It terrifies me, thinking about what could have happened, but it also reminds me of what I learned, that the most valuable things in life aren't the ones you can buy. The things that matter are the people who show up, the ones who choose to stay." Sophie leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence watching the city lights. Jae-won had spent his whole life being taught that value came from prestige, wealth, status, and connections. That the right background mattered more than character. That people like Sophie, working class without elite credentials, were somehow less than people from his world. The fire had burned away all those lies. Sophie had risked her life for his daughter, without hesitation. Not because of money or status or obligation, but because she loved Min-seo. Because when it mattered, she was the kind of person who would walk on a narrow ledge 45 stories up, rather than let a child suffer. That was worth more than every dollar in Jae-won's accounts, every business connection he'd ever made, every prestigious credential he'd ever valued. "I love you," he said into the quiet night. "I love you too," Sophie replied. "All three of us." Because they were a family now, not because of contracts or obligations or carefully maintained appearances, but because they'd chosen each other, every single day, through fear and grief and healing. And that, Jae-won had learned, was the only kind of family that mattered. 6 months after the community center opened, Chairman Choi made his first visit to New York in over 2 years. Jae-won received the call on a Tuesday morning. His father's assistant, speaking in formal Korean, informed him that the chairman would arrive Friday and expected dinner with the family. All of the family, the assistant emphasized. Jae-won's stomach tightened. His father had never met Sophie in person, had never acknowledged the marriage beyond that stiff congratulations message. Now he was coming, and Jae-won knew exactly what this was. A final inspection, a judgment day. "Sophie," Jae-won said that evening, finding her in Min-seo's room helping with homework. "My father is coming to New York." Sophie's pen stilled on the math worksheet. "When?" "Friday. He wants to have dinner, with all of us." Sophie met his eyes, and Jae-won saw the fear there. Fear of not being enough, of being judged and found wanting by a man whose approval meant access to Jae-won's entire world. "Hey," Jae-won said softly, kneeling beside her chair. "You walked on a ledge 45 stories up to save my daughter. You can handle one dinner with my father." "That was different," Sophie said. "That was life or death. This is also life or death," Min-seo piped up seriously. "Because if Grandpa is mean to Sophie, Daddy will be very sad." Despite the tension, both adults smiled. "Out of the mouths of babes," Sophie murmured. Friday arrived too quickly. Sophie had borrowed a dress from her friend, something elegant but understated. She'd pulled her hair back in a sophisticated bun. She looked beautiful, but Jae-won could see the anxiety in the tight line of her shoulders. Chairman Choi arrived at the penthouse at exactly 7 p.m., flanked by his assistant. He was 72 years old, silver-haired, with eyes that missed nothing. He wore a traditional Korean hanbok despite the New York setting, a deliberate choice Jae-won knew, a reminder of their heritage. "Father," Jae-won greeted him in Korean, bowing respectfully. "Welcome." Chairman Choi's gaze swept the penthouse, taking in the changes, the children's artwork on the walls, the family photos, the lived-in warmth that had replaced the sterile perfection of before. Then his eyes landed on Sophie. "So," he said in English, his accent thick but clear, "you are the babysitter. Not my daughter-in-law, not Sophie, the babysitter." Jae-won felt anger flash through him, but Sophie stepped forward calmly, bowing in the Korean style, not perfectly but respectfully. "Chairman Choi," she said, "thank you for coming. We're honored to have you here." "Are you?" Chairman Choi's tone was neutral, unreadable. "My son abandoned his responsibilities in Seoul for you. Left his family, his heritage, his position, all for a girl who watches children." "Father," Jae-won began, but Sophie touched his arm lightly. "I don't blame you for being angry," Sophie said, her voice steady. "If I were you, I'd be angry too. Your son was supposed to follow a certain path, marry a certain type of woman, and instead he married me, someone with no money, no connections, no prestigious family name." Chairman Choi said nothing, waiting. "But I love your son," Sophie continued. "And I love your granddaughter, and I will spend every day of my life making sure they're happy and safe and loved. That's all I can promise you. It might not be enough by your standards, but it's everything by mine." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Then Min-seo appeared from her room, having been instructed to wait. She walked straight to her grandfather and bowed, just as Sophie had taught her. "Hello, grandfather," Min-seo said in careful Korean, the words she'd been practicing. "Welcome to our home." Chairman Choi's expression softened, barely perceptible, but there. He looked at his granddaughter, really looked at her for the first time in years. "You've grown," he said. "I'm 7 now," Min-seo reported proudly. "I go to school and I don't have nightmares anymore. Sophie helped me. She saved me from the fire, and then she helped me not be scared." "Tell me about the fire," Chairman Choi said, surprising everyone. Min-seo launched into the story with the dramatic flair of a 7-year-old. She demonstrated how Sophie had carried her, how they'd climbed out the window, how they'd inched along the scary ledge. "Sophie was so brave," Min-seo concluded. "She could have fallen, but she didn't because she promised she'd keep me safe. and Sophie always keeps her promises. Chairman Choi looked at Sophie with new eyes. You risked your life for my granddaughter. Of course, Sophie said simply. She's my daughter too now. Something shifted in Chairman Choi's face. He turned to Jae-won, speaking in Korean. She doesn't act like hired help trying to impress me. Because she's not hired help, father, Jae-won replied in Korean. She's my wife, Min-seo's mother, and the best thing that's ever happened to this family. Chairman Choi was silent for a long moment. Then, in English, he said to Sophie, My daughter-in-law died in a car accident. My grandson, his voice caught slightly, my grandson, who would have carried our family name, died with her. I thought Jae-won bringing you into this family so quickly was disrespectful to their memory. Sophie waited, letting him finish. But I see now, Chairman Choi continued, that you are not replacing Soo-jin. You are healing the wounds her loss left behind. There is a difference. It wasn't approval exactly, but it was acknowledgement. It was a door opening, just a crack. Dinner was still tense, still formal, but Chairman Choi asked Sophie questions about her studies, her family, the community center. He spoke to Min-seo in Korean, teaching her words she didn't know. He watched how Sophie and Jae-won moved around each other in the kitchen, the easy partnership they'd built. At the end of the evening, as Chairman Choi was leaving, he stopped at the door. I raised my son to value duty above all else, he said to Sophie. To think of the family legacy, the business, the reputation. But perhaps, he paused, choosing his words carefully, perhaps I forgot to teach him that duty without heart is just performance. You have shown him what it means to serve something with your whole heart. For that, I am grateful. It was the closest to approval Sophie was likely to get. She bowed again. Thank you, sir. After Chairman Choi left, Sophie collapsed on the couch, her hands shaking with released tension. You were incredible, Jae-won said, sitting beside her and pulling her close. I thought I was going to throw up on his expensive shoes, Sophie admitted. But you didn't. You stood there and showed him exactly why I fell in love with you. Min-seo climbed onto the couch between them. Grandpa wasn't as scary as I thought. No, Jae-won agreed, stroking his daughter's hair. He wasn't. The next week, Sophie's parents came to Manhattan for their first visit to the penthouse. Mrs. Martinez walked through the space with wide eyes, speaking rapid Spanish to her husband, marveling at the view, the space, the obvious wealth. But when they sat down for the dinner Sophie had cooked, pupusas, her mother's recipe, Mrs. Martinez looked at her daughter with concern. Mija, she said, are you happy here? Really happy? Not just comfortable? Sophie looked around the table, at Jae-won, who was attempting to eat a pupusa with chopsticks while Min-seo giggled at him, at her father, who was talking to Jae-won in broken English about soccer, at Min-seo, who was teaching Sophie's younger brother how to use the fancy espresso machine. I'm happy, Mama, Sophie said. Really happy. Mrs. Martinez studied her daughter's face, then nodded, satisfied. Good. Because money doesn't buy happiness. I was worried you forgot that. I could never forget, Sophie said. You taught me too well. A month later, Min-seo had to give a presentation at school about someone you think is a hero. Most kids chose superheroes or athletes or celebrities. Min-seo chose Sophie. Sophie and Jae-won sat in the back of the second-grade classroom, watching Min-seo stand at the front with her poster board covered in photos and drawings. This is Sophie, Min-seo began, pointing to a photo from their wedding. She's my stepmom, but really she's just my mom because she's been taking care of me since I was 4. She flipped to a drawing, childish but recognizable, of a stick figure carrying another stick figure on a narrow line, with a building beside them. When I was little, there was a fire in our building, Min-seo explained, her voice strong and clear. Sophie didn't wait for firefighters. She climbed out the window and carried me on a tiny ledge really high up. She could have fallen, but she didn't because she promised she'd keep me safe. The other children gasped appropriately. The teacher watched with misty eyes. But that's not the only reason she's a hero, Min-seo continued. She's a hero because she shows up every day. She helps me with homework even when it's hard. She makes me laugh when I'm sad. She taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. Min-seo looked directly at Sophie. I want to be like her when I grow up. I want to help people like she helps people. In the back of the classroom, Sophie was crying. Jae-won held her hand, feeling his own eyes burn. After the presentation, several parents approached them. One mother said, "That's quite a story. You must be very proud." "We are," Jae-won said, his arm around Sophie's shoulders. "Every single day." Driving home, Min-seo chattered excitedly about her presentation. But Sophie was quiet, staring out the window. "What are you thinking?" Jae-won asked. "I'm thinking," Sophie said slowly, "that I started this job just trying to pay my tuition. Just trying to make it through community college. I never imagined I'd end up here. Married to you, mother to this incredible little girl. Running a community center that helps families. It's so much more than I ever dreamed." "You gave us more than you'll ever know," Jae-won said. "No," Sophie corrected gently. "We gave each other exactly what we needed. You needed someone to show up. I needed someone to see me. Min-seo needed someone to love her through her grief. We saved each other." That night, after Min-seo was asleep, Jae-won pulled up the old security footage on his laptop, something he hadn't watched in over a year. He found that night, the night of the fire. He watched Sophie carry Min-seo out onto that ledge. Watched her inch along that impossibly narrow path, her bare feet finding purchase on concrete, her face set with determination, despite the terror he knew she must have felt. "Why are you watching that?" Sophie asked, appearing in the doorway. "Because I want to remember," Jae-won said. "I want to remember the exact moment my life changed, the moment I stopped looking at credentials and started seeing character. The moment I realized that the most important things can't be bought or earned through prestige. They have to be chosen, every single day." Sophie sat beside him, watching her own image on the screen. "I was so scared. But you did it anyway. For her. I'd do anything for her." "I know," Jae-won said, closing the laptop and pulling Sophie into his arms. "That's why I love you. That's why you're exactly where you belong." 2 years after that conversation, Sophie stood in the bathroom of their penthouse at 6 a.m., staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines. She'd suspected for weeks. The nausea, the exhaustion, the way certain smells made her stomach turn. But seeing the confirmation made it real in a way that stole her breath. A baby. Their baby. "Sophie?" Jae-won's voice came from the bedroom, heavy with sleep. "Are you okay?" She opened the bathroom door, the test still in her hand. Jae-won sat up immediately, his executive instincts kicking in even before he was fully awake. "What's wrong?" he asked. Then his eyes landed on the test. His face went through a rapid series of emotions. Confusion, recognition, shock, and finally, overwhelming joy. "Are you—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. "I'm pregnant," Sophie said, her voice wavering between laughter and tears. "We're having a baby." Jae-won was across the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms, his face buried in her hair. His shoulders shook, and Sophie realized he was crying. "I never thought I'd get this chance again," he whispered. "After Soo-jin, after losing the baby, I thought—" "I know," Sophie said softly, holding him tight. "I know." They stood there in the doorway between bathroom and bedroom, holding each other as the sun rose over Manhattan, painting their world in shades of gold and new beginnings. "Min-seo is going to lose her mind," Jae-won said finally, pulling back to look at Sophie's face. "She's been asking for a sibling for months. Should we tell her now? Are you kidding? If we wait, she'll never forgive us." They found Min-seo in her room, already awake and reading. At 9 years old, she'd become a voracious reader, especially books about psychology and helping people. Min-seo, Sophie said, sitting on the edge of the bed. We have something to tell you. Min-seo looked up, her eyes sharp. You're pregnant. Both adults froze. How did you? Jae-won started. You've been drinking ginger tea every morning, Min-seo said matter-of-factly. And yesterday you told Mrs. Park you couldn't have coffee because your stomach was sensitive. Plus, you keep crying at commercials and you never cry at commercials. It wasn't hard to figure out. Sophie laughed, wiping at her eyes. When did you get so observant? I want to be a psychologist, remember? Observation is important. Min-seo put down her book, her expression suddenly vulnerable. So, I'm going to be a big sister? Yes, Sophie said. How do you feel about that? Min-seo was quiet for a moment and Sophie felt a flutter of worry. But then Min-seo's face split into the widest smile they'd seen in months. I feel like I've been waiting forever, she said, throwing her arms around Sophie. I'm going to be the best big sister ever. I'll teach them everything. I'll protect them. You'll be perfect, Jae-won said, joining the embrace. Just like you are now. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Sophie worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep up with the community center, her graduate classes, and growing a human being. You need to slow down, Jae-won told her one evening, finding her at her desk at 11 p.m., reviewing grant applications for the center. I can't, Sophie said, not looking up. We have 50 families on the wait list for therapy services, 50 kids who need help, and we don't have the funding to hire more therapists. Sophie. Jae-won took the papers from her hands. The center will still be there tomorrow, but you need to rest. The baby needs you to rest. I know, Her voice broke slightly. These kids need help, Jae-won. I see their intake forms. I see what they're going through. And I have all this privilege now, all these resources, and I can't help them fast enough. Jae-won knelt beside her chair. You're one person. You can't save everyone. I have to try. No, Jae-won said firmly but gently. You have to take care of yourself so you can keep helping people for years to come. There's a difference between dedication and self-destruction. Trust me. I learned that lesson the hard way. Sophie knew he was right. She'd been pushing too hard, trying to prove something. To Chairman Choi, to Jae-won's business associates who still whispered about the working-class girl, to herself. Okay, she said finally. Okay, I'll delegate more. I'll take actual breaks. I'll be home for dinner. Thank you, Jae-won said, kissing her forehead. Because I need you. Min-seo needs you. And this baby needs you. The world can wait. 6 months into the pregnancy, Chairman Choi made another visit, this time unannounced. Jae-won opened the door to find his father standing there with a large box wrapped in traditional Korean paper. Father, Jae-won said, surprised, you didn't tell me you were coming. I wanted it to be a surprise, Chairman Choi said, stepping inside. He looked around the penthouse, which was now decorated with baby preparation. A partially assembled crib in the corner, pregnancy books on the coffee table, tiny clothes folded on the couch. Where is Sophie? He asked. Resting. The doctor put her on modified bed rest last week. Her blood pressure was getting too high. Chairman Choi's expression tightened with concern. Is she all right? She will be. She was just doing too much. But she's listening to the doctor now. Good. Chairman Choi held out the box. This is for her and for the baby. Inside was a traditional Korean hanbok, tiny, exquisitely made, in soft white and pale blue. Beneath it was another hanbok, adult-sized, designed for postpartum wear. My wife wore this after Jae-won was born, Chairman Choi said quietly. It is tradition in our family. I would like Sophie to have it if she wishes. Jae-won felt emotion tighten his throat. Father, she is family, Chairman Choi interrupted. She has proven herself more than worthy. She saved my granddaughter. She made you happy again. She is expanding her community work to help those who need it most. These are not the actions of someone seeking wealth or status. These are the actions of someone with genuine character. Thank you, Jae-won said. This will mean everything to her. When Sophie woke from her nap, she found Chairman Choi sitting in the living room, drinking tea that Jae-won had prepared. Chairman Choi, she said, surprised, her hand instinctively going to her rounded belly. I didn't know you were visiting. I came to bring you a gift, he said, gesturing to the box on the table, and to apologize. Apologize? Sophie sat down carefully, her movement awkward with the pregnancy. For what? For judging you before knowing you, Chairman Choi said. For believing that value comes only from background and education. You have taught this family what true strength looks like. Min-seo thrives because of you. My son smiles again because of you. And you are creating something meaningful with your community center, helping families who society often forgets. He paused, choosing his words carefully. In Korea, we say hyo, filial piety, respect for family. I taught my son this value, but I taught it narrowly. I believed family meant only bloodline, only tradition. You have shown us that family is also choice. It is loyalty. It is showing up, as you always say. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. Pregnancy hormones made her cry at everything these days. But this was different. Thank you, she said softly. That means more than you know. Open the gift, Chairman Choi said. When Sophie saw the handbox, especially the one that had belonged to Jae-won's mother, she couldn't hold back the tears. I can't accept this, she said. This is too precious, too meaningful. You are family, Chairman Choi said firmly. This is where it belongs. That evening, after Chairman Choi had left, Sophie sat with the tiny handbook in her lap, running her fingers over the delicate embroidery. Your father is really accepting me, she said to Jae-won, wonder in her voice. Not just tolerating, actually accepting. He sees what I see, Jae-won said, sitting beside her. Someone remarkable. 4 months later, Sophie went into labor at 3 a.m. Jae-won drove them to the hospital, the same hospital where they'd gone after the fire, where Sophie had refused treatment until Min-seo had been examined first. The same nurses who'd treated Sophie's cut feet that night were working the maternity ward now, and they remembered her. You're the one who saved the little girl, one nurse said as she checked Sophie's vitals. Walked on that ledge. I remember thinking you were either the bravest or craziest person I'd ever met. Both, Sophie gasped between contractions. Min-seo arrived at the hospital with Sophie's parents, all of them bringing coffee and nervous energy. Chairman Choi, to everyone's surprise, flew in from Seoul and arrived just as Sophie was being moved to delivery. I wanted to be here, he said simply, for the birth of my grandchild. The labor was long, 18 hours, but when Sophie finally held her son in her arms, every moment of pain evaporated. We're naming him Sung-min, Jae-won announced to the family gathered outside. It means successful and clever in Korean, and his middle name is James, after Sophie's father. James Martinez cried at that announcement, and Mrs. Martinez hugged Jae-won so tightly he could barely breathe. When they brought Sung-min home, Min-seo was waiting, having decorated the entire penthouse with hand-drawn, "Welcome Home" baby signs. Can I hold him? She asked, her voice hushed with reverence. Sophie carefully placed Sung-min in Min-seo's arms, supervising closely. Min-seo stared down at her baby brother with an expression of pure wonder. Hi, Sung-min, she whispered. I'm your big sister. I'm going to teach you everything. I'm going to protect you just like Sophie protected me. You're so lucky. You have the best mom in the world. She's not just brave, she's kind. And she makes the best pancakes, and she always keeps her promises. Sophie watched her daughter with her son and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. Our family is complete, Jae-won said quietly, standing beside her. Yes, Sophie agreed. It is. But she was wrong. 2 years later, they adopted a little girl named Maria from El Salvador, a 7-year-old whose parents had died, leaving her in an orphanage that Sophie's community center had started working with. Then, 3 years after that, they fostered twin boys whose mother was struggling with addiction recovery, and when she successfully completed treatment, she asked if the boys could stay with Sophie and Jae-won while she got back on her feet. The penthouse that had once been sterile and empty was now chaos. 5 children, laughter, tears, homework everywhere, toys in every corner. "This is not what I imagined when I hired you," Jae-won said one evening, surveying the disaster that was their living room. "Is it better or worse?" Sophie asked, trying to separate 2 kids fighting over a video game controller. Jae-won looked at his wife, gray hair starting to show at her temples, exhaustion lines around her eyes, her shirt stained with someone's spilled juice, and he had never seen anyone more beautiful. "Better," he said. "So much better." What do you think? Did Jae-won make the right choice in following his heart over family expectations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on love across different worlds and what truly makes a family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional narratives like this. Rate this story from 0 to 10, and let us know what kind of stories you'd like to see next. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.